Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. We are currently 10.5 days into patch 3.27, and you know what that means? It means it is time to have a look at the meta that's developing, have a look at some of the top performing builds so far, and also one or two that I just want to shout out as interesting to mention. One I particularly like to start with is an Occultist that takes advantage of the new Monastery Bell unique item, using it in conjunction with the recently buffed Shattershard unique. And I'll put a link to a video outlining that in the description of this below. One of the things that I thought was a phenomenal piece of tech here was using the staff mastery that allows you to gain Unholy Might when you block. But with Monastery Bell, you're constantly getting credit for having blocked, even though you may not have blocked. And as a result, you pretty much always have 100% physical to chaos conversion on the build, which then empowers a lot of interesting shenanigans. So that was definitely something that jumped out at me. But it's not part of the meta, it's just an interesting thing off to the side of the meta. Let's start talking about those builds that have managed to be 2% or more of the level 96 plus characters, and also some honourable mentions for some that are at 1%. Now, Trade League build diversity has quite literally never been as high as it is in patch 3.27. Now, this is based upon both skill use and also on Ascendancy Split. We have a very, very large selection of skills that are doing well at the moment. It's never perfect, there's always space for improvement, but this is something that, at least from a week 2 of the league perspective, Grenadier games have never quite gotten as good as they are now. No skill is exceeding 10% of the meta, no Ascendancy is exceeding 14% of the meta, and while there are a couple of Ascendancies that are performing pretty badly at the moment, they do actually have reasonable builds. So it's not like you can say Saboteur is completely dumpster tier at the moment. Saboteur is good at a couple of things, they're just things people aren't interested in doing at the moment. For those of you that haven't seen one of these videos before, what I do here is I look at the ladder. This is a list Grenadier Games put out of the top 15,000 characters by XP. Now, the cutoff to be on this is pretty high. It is 70% of the way through level 98. This is higher by far than the case last league. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, the breach mechanic does give a fair amount of XP. Secondly, engaging with the breach mechanic is a little bit less rippy than engaging with the mercenaries mechanic was. But also, I think probably the single most important thing is that the nerfs to map modifier effect mean that players are dying a lot less than they were in the past. All of this information that's found on the ladder, the website POE.ninja scrapes it regularly. They actually have records on both people who are currently on the ladder, but also people who have historically been on the ladder but have fallen off it. Now, in this video, I'm going to be looking at characters that are level 96 plus. So this is going to catch players that had an explosive start, got onto the ladder, but then fell off later. At least as long as they've played enough to reach level 96 and they've been non-reckless enough to reach level 96. And also it will catch characters that may have had a slower start, but that have caught up later. And there's about 46,000 characters that are indexed by POE.ninja and that fit this criteria of 96 plus. Game hard modes, they always constrain choices. They promote strong, easy to start builds. This is true for solo self-found, true for hardcore, true for ruthless. I had a look at the more popular versions here. So softcore solo self-found, hardcore solo self-found, and hardcore trade enabled. And when I had a look there, it was definitely the case that build diversity was lower this league. And there was a slight shuffle around of which builds were excelling and which ones weren't. We'll talk about that when we get to Earthshatter, because Earthshatter was excelling in all of the hard modes, whether it be solo self-found, hardcore, or both at the same time. Earthshatter was getting better the more hard modes that are in play. It's also the case that really well-written build guides end up tending to warp the meta quite a bit, but this league there has not been as much convergence on one or two build guides as there was last league. And I think one of the big things here is that most of the people that people look to for starter builds tended to settle on different things because the meta was feeling so wide open. There's a lot of excitement for Elementalist early. Elementalist has done well this league, but it's certainly not oppressively good, and neither is anything else. So let's talk about the impact of new endgame content that's been added to the game. Last league, we had the 3 Incarnations. This league, we got the Uber Incarnations added as permanent endgame content. This exists in standard as well. Very few people seem to be focused on building characters solely to take down the Uber versions of the Incarnations. There's definitely people fighting them, but they tend not to be building specialist boss killers just for these new bosses. As for things that are not present in standard, the new breach content is rewarding ailment proliferation and other similar sorts of mechanics to propagate kills through packs. Whether it be Beric's Respite, Foulborn Beric's Respite, Foulborn the Embalmer, Asenath's Gentle Touch, all sorts of things that cause kill propagation through packs. But at the same time, the breach mechanic isn't requiring these particular mechanics, and so we're seeing builds that don't really have good access to them still managing to do fine here. Something does need to be mentioned though, and that is stealth changes to items continue. Last league, a lot of people leveled a champion, then got very, very disappointed when the new buffs to the champion were inaccessible to them because the unique item, the Celestial Brace, was swapped between rare rarity and mythic rarity from one of the Uber bosses. Now, there are at least 2 high-profile Drop Anywhere unique items that have had significant rarity changes in patch 3.27. Ephemeral Edge. Historically, this was tier 3 for a long time. In 3.26, it was changed to tier 2. That was a big enough jump in rarity, something like 6 times rarer, but this league, it has gone to tier 0. And whilst when I was writing this, I said that it was suspected to be tier 0, I did check in with Nerdy Joe, who convinced me it is definitely a tier 0 now, no suspected about it. There's a number of ways that this is told. Inscribed ultimatums, Bastards' gold fees to trade for it in asynchronous trade. Everything that we've been able to check so far agrees. This is now a tier 0. The other thing we know had a big stealth nerf to its drop rate was Kaom's Primacy, from tier 4 to tier 2. Tier 4 to tier 2 being only 2 tiers undersells how big a nerf this is to the drop rate of Kaom's Primacy. The thing is that this league has provided very, very good alternatives to it. Primacy wasn't used as an endgame weapon really. Primacy was instead used as something that was the best thing you could get right now, and then when you were rich, you got something that was better. Well, now in this league, you don't need to be rich to get something that's better, because this league is very, very generous with replacements for Kaom's Primacy. The same is not quite true for Ephemeral Edge, but there are plenty of good alternatives to it. In this way, it hasn't been quite as catastrophic as the situation last league where the champions ended up just all getting boned by GGG's changes. Instead, this time, there are genuine alternatives. If you are planning on using Ephemeral Edge, you're now kind of stuck on Energy Blade instead, or alternately, you can pick up an Ephemeral Edge in asynchronous trade. They are actually surprisingly cheap for how extremely powerful and extremely rare the item is. And with Kaom's Primacy, you just use a pure Phys Axe instead. Lastly, let's talk about other item notes, because unique item use is just up across the board. This is in a league that is very generous when it comes to giving you good rare items. Not quite as good as Recombinators at the top end, but definitely very, very strong in giving you very good rare items very early in progression. And what we're seeing is that there are some generic good stuff uniques that are seeing an uptick in use. We're seeing some build around items seeing an uptick in use. And we're also seeing what I term defensive archetype defining unique items. Some of them are going up. For example, Cloak of Flame. I think Cloak of Flame may be the highest use it's ever been in the game. And this is one of those items that just transforms the value of all of the other stats you have on your defensive gear. Pretty much all builds that want a pure defense chest piece are converging on Cloak of Flame. Stuff like the 4th Vow is still in the game. It's still really good. It's not been nerfed or anything like that. But people are electing to use Cloak of Flame instead. Likewise, Doppelganger's Guise, Lightning Coil, and a number of just less popular choices that are also still pretty good, like the Brass Dome. These are having their use decreased, and that's all going to Cloak of Flame. And there's been a real convergence on that one item. It's also worth noting that this is happening in an environment where unique items across the board are way cheaper than they've pretty much ever been, due to the way asynchronous trade increases supply of them. Not quite true for every single unique, but most of them are way cheaper than they've ever been. And on top of that, fusing orbs are incredibly cheap as well. So if there is an off-meta chest that you want, chances are you can pick it up for a chaos, and then you can link it for an average of 100 or 120 chaos, depending upon how unlucky you get when it comes to your fusing orbs. One of the big things here though is that Foulborn items came out too late for people to really plan builds around them. And as a result, it's only people that are making a second build or that have aggressively respec'd their first character, they're the ones that are using Foulborn items. I think the Assassin Ascendancy would be much more popular if we had known Foulborn the Embalmer existed before League start. This item, the versions that have the Poison Pseudo-Proliferation on them, this is something that people chose Pathfinder because they knew they could get that stat there. Whereas if they had known beforehand that that was just one way to get the stat, they might have been more open to either trying the new Assassin or potentially even trying something else entirely. Now, there are definitely some people that have 2 characters or even more characters than that yet, but I do think it is the case that most people make their second character a little bit later than this in the league, and so they're not yet showing up with their second characters on POE.Ninja or on the ladder. So, a picture is worth 1,000 words, they say. Here's a 1,000-word essay on the current state of the Ascendancy Split. You'll see that even though this is the best it's ever been, we do still have a lot dedicated to the top 4 Ascendancies: Necromancer, Chieftain, Elementalist, and Deadeye. And the top 3 are all 14% of the meta, and the difference between them is just a rounding error. And then it's a big jump down to Deadeye, a big jump down to Slayer and Hierophant, and then another modest jump down to quite a number of Ascendancies, all the way down to Trickster here, and maybe even Occultist. And then we start to have more of a fall off as we get to the bottom two. But it's worth noting that whilst the bottom two, the Guardian and the Saboteur, they're not very popular this league, I think with the Guardian, there are genuinely good builds for it. Likewise, the Saboteur, both of them do have their place. It's just that neither of them are particularly shiny and new, but they do things well. We don't have any Ascendancy, actually with the possible exception of the Ascendant, that is in crisis mode at the moment. And the Ascendant really just has Aura bots going for it. That is the main thing that Ascendancy is currently doing well. And you'll see it falls off further if you go and have a look in Solo Self-Found. The big news that we've got here is that pretty much nothing is unplayable here. There are two genuinely unpopular Ascendancies, but they're not absolutely dumpster tier. They're just old and stale. In the case of the Guardian, hasn't been refreshed for a while. It's something that's pretty thoroughly explored. It's something that's not so overwhelmingly strong that people feel pulled into playing it. And people that are interested in playing the things the Guardian tends to excel at, they're considering other things instead first. And likewise, the Saboteur, it is extremely good at one build. It is the best Ascendancy if you want to play a Rolling Magma Miner. However, playing Rolling Magma Miner is something that is like constantly flashbanging yourself, and as a result, most players, myself included, have negative interest in playing that particular build. But you can't argue with the results. It is a functioning build, and it's something that the Saboteur is the best choice for. So every Ascendancy does have its place at the moment, even if some have more of a place than others. Elementalist performed really well early on. It was at the top days 1, 2, and 3, and it's still performing very solidly at the moment. Basically, it's just at a healthy level. It is probably the best Ascendancy days 1, 2, and 3 at the moment, but I don't think it's problematically good on days 1, 2, and 3, and other Ascendancies do tend to pull ahead with better gear, and this league had a lot of access to really good gear. Right, so let's start talking skill use. Nothing is over 10%, or when I say nothing is over 10%, there are some that are just a smidgen over 10%, but they round down to 10%. So first and third, however, are somewhat similar archetypes, and so some people might decide that actually there is a little bit of a build diversity problem because they might cluster those two together into one category. I think though, because they scale so differently, they're played on different Ascendancies, I think it is actually fine to link them together, even though they are both variants of Kinetic Blast. So among our successful builds, we have ranged attack builds, we have DOT spell builds, we have melee attack, we have spell trigger builds, we have minion builds, and we have more. Now, bows have fallen off really hard, however. I think what's going on here is that there's a section of the Path of Exile player base that love bows in general, but right now, those players are electing to play with a wand instead, because it's similar enough to the playstyle I want, and wands are probably slightly better right now. It's not the case that bow skills are dead though, they're just a little bit unpopular, but they're good enough to run everything in the game. So let's start with number 1, Kinetic Blast. 10% of the meta, up a lot from last league. The new wands help a lot here, as does the fact the Genesis tree is pretty good at crafting rare gear, but one of the key things that's going on here is that the league mechanic plays really well with ranged builds. And when it comes to ranged skills this league, Kinetic Blast is outperforming the new wand attack skills, both the very playable Kinetic Fusillade and the less effective Somatic Shell, and at the same time KB is also outperforming old favourite Power Siphon. Majority of people playing KB are playing a Deadeye. However, many are playing the Warden, many are playing the Elementalist. All three of these offer a lot to a Kinetic Blast wand attack character, but they offer different things, and that adds to the sense of variety here. In second place, we have Righteous Fire, which is exploding upwards. This build is played more than its power level might lead you to expect, but it's just a very simple, very satisfying playstyle. You charge into a pack of monsters, the weakest enemies around you burn down a little bit. Then one of those monsters explodes with the 5% Henikora proc, and that hits everything within 3 meters for absolutely devastating damage, and that damage ignites. There are then versions of Righteous Fire that invest very heavily into spreading those ignites, and there are versions that don't, and they just focus on dealing localized damage closer to the character. Both of these work, and most importantly, both of them have fantastic sounding explosions. That is one of the things I think that makes Righteous Fire so satisfying to play. Ultimately, this is a really solid build. Now, you will notice if you have a look at POE.Ninja data that Fire Trap is something that also comes up, and you'd be thinking, hey GOG, you forgot Fire Trap here. No, almost every single Fire Trap build is also a Righteous Fire build. So I'm calling them Righteous Fire builds, and then if Fire Trap was taken on its own as a skill for builds that don't use Righteous Fire, it's going to be less than 1/4 of 1% of the player base. The reason that players that are playing Righteous Fire also use Fire Trap in their build is that Fire Trap scales off most of the same stats that Righteous Fire does, and as a result, there is tremendous synergy there. And also, Fire Trap fills in for a weakness for Righteous Fire, which is that its single target damage can be derisory. Next, we have the other Kinetic Blast, Kinetic Blast of Clustering. Now, this is a very, very different skill, and that's why it's played on different ascendancies to traditional Kinetic Blast most of the time. It also tends to invest in different areas of the passive tree, and as a result, I'm definitely considering it a different skill. This builds very differently, it's interested in different items to the base Kinetic Blast, and most importantly, it gains a lot from the new Rune Graft of Refraction. This thing is absolutely phenomenal when it comes to Kinetic Blast of Clustering, and it's the reason the skill has gone from seeing very little play in the past to seeing quite a lot now. It does everything that you want on a Kinetic Blast of Clustering build, whilst having a very, very low opportunity cost for you. Whereas for other builds, you could use it, but it comes at a very high price. Dropping down quite a bit to 4th place, we have the Phys DOT Elementalist. Now this tends to use Exsanguinate and or Reap, and usually it tends to focus on Reap, but this is something that you can definitely play around with. It is really defined, in my opinion, by the use of Brutality support alongside a Golem package. So if you're playing Reap linked to Brutality support, and you're playing an Elementalist with a Golem package, then this is the build you're likely to be playing. There are definitely other Reap builds that exist, but this is the main one of them. One thing that's important to note here is that there are a couple of versions of this, and a lot of the time people will start out with a build that uses Corrupting Fever. This will then help them propagate damage across the screen, but at some point, many of those players will then elect to remove the Corrupting Fever setup and retool their character, potentially removing Brutality support, and then going with other scaling vectors in order to do more single target damage. Not saying that one of these is better than the other. Ultimately, single target DPS versus damage projection, this is a trade-off. Pick the one that you think is more important for the content you're running. Some of the other spicy versions of this use the same skill, primarily Reap, and then scale damage through Ignite, through instant application cold damage, and through more options. These will tend to focus on different parts of the core package. Ultimately, this shell is extremely versatile all around. There's a lot of things that you can do with it. 5th position, we have the Cast When Stunned Chieftain. This is 5% of the meta at the moment. Now, this is interesting in that it is often people's endgame when they start out as Righteous Fire. Captures a lot of the things people like about Righteous Fire Chieftain, but it does so in a really, really explosive package. This is a build that can become very tanky, and it can scale damage extremely high, but it does tend to falter quite a bit when it goes up against a solo boss. Against solo bosses, this can struggle sometimes. However, one of the things that the Cast When Stunned Chieftain absolutely excels at is in doing the Simulacrum. And not just beating the Simulacrum, but beating it pretty much AFK. And this is extremely effective in a league where many people want access to the Delirium Bloodline, and the way that you get the Delirium Bloodline, if you're not able to beat it yourself, is to engage a carry service, and therefore pay someone else who can defeat the Simulacrum for you. These Cast When Stunned Chieftains are incredibly good at doing just that. The other thing that really caught my eye as something fascinating is that there is a new Cast When Stunned Gladiator version. I haven't fully investigated this, but there's a number of people playing it. And the way you can pick these up is have a look for Gladiator builds that are on POE.ninja that use Detonate Dead of Scavenging as their primary skill. It'll always be linked to Cast When Stunned. And they will also be using the unique shield Azadi Crest, which has been added as a tier 4 drop anywhere unique, i.e. something that is in the second most common category of unique items, the same rarity as Goldrum, and something like 5 times as common as Tabula Rasa. You're going to get a lot of these, so you won't have any trouble picking one up for yourself, and in fact, you won't even have that much trouble finding one that's got 10% chance to block on it. Next, we're going to jump over to the most traditionally melee build around, and that is Earthshatter. This is the Berserker Slam archetype, although it does not have to be a Berserker. It just tends to be that people play Earthshatter on the Berserker, and then there is another Slam that is more popular on the Slayer that we'll get to later. This can also be played on the Juggernaut as well. This is a build that gets going really well on really dumpster tier gear, and it is the top performing melee skill for a certain definition of melee. Almost universally, this uses a two-handed axe, and this has been the overwhelmingly most successful build if you look at players who are playing with one or both of the hardcore or solo self-found rule sets applied. This mostly replaces last league's Volcanic Fissure of Snaking builds. The difference is that VFOS was actually overpowered, whereas Earthshatter is simply a good build. Volcanic Fissure of Snaking is a skill that still functions, but it functions only adequately whereas Earthshatter has a reasonably similar playstyle, scales reasonably similarly, and is genuinely good, whereas VFOS is just meh. And ultimately, several other slams, including ones that won't make it into this video, are better than VFOS is now. Next is the top performing minion build, Holy Relic of Conviction, 3% of the meta. Now, this plays almost like a custom critical strike build. Use it back and spray projectiles with Lancing Steel of Spraying, and those projectiles cause your minions to let out explosions. Those explosions do the killing for you. There's a bunch of different ways people scale this, and ultimately, I'm clustering them all together, even though you could say that there are different versions of this build. It's a very powerful setup, and it has a number of very important breakpoints to understand if you want to play this, and especially if you want to min-max it. Near universally, this is played on the Necromancer Ascendancy. It's not absolutely impossible to play on the Guardian, but the Necromancer does tend to do it better. Penance Brand of Dissipation is next, also 3% of the meta. This is a great boss killer still, and it's played in many different forms. This, probably more than anything else, is one where you want to really study what other people are doing and work out the best way to go about this, because the number of ways that you can build this skill is almost as high as the average number of Penance Brand gems you'll need to take into the Labyrinth if you desire to get a 21-23 Penance Brand of Dissipation for your character at some point. Spectre is next, taking up 3% of the meta as well. Now this has just been nudged out from top minion build status by Holy Relic. It's also typically played on the Necromancer, and it has very many variations again. This is like Penance Brand of Dissipation. It's one where you'll need to do extensive study if you want to play it. But there are a few unique items, including one that's quite new, that end up being extremely good here. Unending Hunger, the Dark Monarch, and Bitterbind Point, which was recently changed and got some new mods that it can unveil on it. These are all very commonly played on Spectre builds. And next we're going to jump in to the 2% club. I'm going to particularly mention Ground Slam of Earthshaking because this is something that is the other side of when we were talking about slams before, and a lot of people have gone over to Earthshatter. Ground Slam of Earthshaking is mostly played on the Slayer, and it is essentially where you go if Volcanic Fissure of Snaking last league was the most fun build you've ever played, and you were playing the Slayer version of it. Well, in that case, Ground Slam of Earthshaking is for you, whereas if you'd said Berserker was the way you played it last league, then I would have instead said go with Earthshatter. Ground Slam of Earthshaking is genuinely good, but it's just not as far above all other slams as Volcanic Fissure of Snaking was last league. Other entrants in the 2% club, we have Exsanguinate played as a mine build. We have Cyclone, we have Animate Guardian, we have Molten Strike of the Zenith, we have Viper Strike of the Mamba, we have Cyclone of Tumult, and we have Flicker Strike. And notice how much melee there is here, because with melee, it's not like there is one individual build that you definitely go with. There's a lot of different options here that are all working reasonably well, and so melee is more of the meta than it looks like when you only consider the top 4 builds. Additionally, many of these are movement setups. So we have Cyclone of Tumult, we have Flicker Strike. All 3 of those are in the 2% club. And if you were to decide to group them together, which I do not do, but if you did decide to group them together, they would end up being in the top 5 overall. Finally, there's another 10 or so skills at 1% each. Here it's a little bit trickier to tell because sometimes they are secondary skills that are used on another build. So for instance, you might see Flame Wall or Lancing Steel of Spraying here, where most of the damage the character deals is not done by these skills. So they're not part of the 10. There are 10 that are used as primary skills. The full list is on POE.ninja, and I recommend that if you have a look at it, you filter it to level 96+. I want to finish by talking about some of the breakout uniques of this patch. So, Cloak of Flame is back with a vengeance. It's not like it ever really went away, but it's way more popular this league than it was last league, and that's in a context where it is much easier to get a really good rare item than it was last league. Foulborn the Red Dream is enormous this league. Foulborn Beric's Respite and Foulborn Kikazaru both have really good versions as well. But one that I wanted to mention, because it didn't make it into my video on popular Foulborn items, mostly because I didn't want to extend it to include new things that were very expensive, is a Foulborn version of Rathpinth Globe. This shield has at least 2 mods that can be Foulborn, but the one that is potentially really explosive, 5% increased damage over time per 100 player maximum life. It is just that this can scale so incredibly high that makes this end up being as good as it is. This is a very potent and very powerful item, and it's dozens of divines for very good reason. If you do want to try and target it, then the way that you would do that is making shields more common on the Genesis tree, and then making intelligence items more common, but also simultaneously making strength and dexterity items rarer. Once you've done that, you're still going to have to pray because it is still not going to be common at all, but you will have done all you can to bias the tree towards that direction. I am at this point going to leave it here. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.